the Four Noble Truths are explained in all the different traditions of Buddhists that exist in the world. Basically, we have three well-known traditions. The Southern tradition, which is also known as Theravadan tradition, and Chinese Mahayana, and then we have Vajrayana tradition. Actually, according to the Tibetan scriptural understanding, Vajrayana and Mahayana are not two different traditions. Vajrayana is a portion of the Mahayana. Mahayana is a bigger kind of group that includes the Vajrayana inside it. Somehow, all over the world, nowadays it is well known to have three different traditions. When it comes to explain the essential topic, the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, all these different traditions, they agree that the Four Noble Truths, the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, are the very basic and foundation teachings of the Buddha. In fact, the Buddha's first sermon also was on the Four Noble Truths. There are scholars who claim that there was another kind of sermon before that, but kind of in the general understanding, the common understanding between all the scholars is that the Buddha's first sermon, or the turning of the wheel of Dharma, was the Dhammachakra Parivartan Sutra, or Dharmachakra Parivartan Sutra. It depends on which language we use, in Pali and Sanskrit. So, in that sutra, Buddha exclusively taught the Four Noble Truths. And he taught the Four Noble Truths to his kind of primary disciples, the five disciples with whom he was very, very kind of well acquainted. So from that onward, the teachings on the Four Noble Truths became the foundation of Buddhist practices and the Buddhist teaching. And it is very clear in the Vinaya scriptures and other scriptures that the teachings on the Four Noble Truths were the main method of Buddha to guide or to lead a kind of common disciple or the follower towards the achievements of, we say there are four different levels of achievement according to the general common Buddhism, like stream entry, non-returner, once returner, non-returner, and the arhathood. So that was one of the main technique that was employed by the Buddha throughout his lifetime. Actually, whenever Buddha had any encounter with any new disciple, he immediately doesn't use to teach the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. In the beginning, he used to converse with those people, talk to them about benefits of doing the practice of generosity, charity, and practice of morality and all those things. And after some time, when he realizes that this person is a suitable person to teach the Four Noble Truths, and through that guide him towards the attainments, then only he starts to reveal the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. That was his technique. So it's a very basic foundational teaching of the Buddha. So it's commonly accepted in all the Buddhist different Buddhist traditions. But now we have little differences in explanation of the Four Noble Truths. Of course, the Four Noble Truths are same. Namely, in English language we say the truth of suffering, truth of the origin of suffering, and truth of the cessation of suffering, and the true mark that leads to the cessation of suffering. So these are the Four Noble Truths. But the way the Four Noble Truths are explained or taught in different traditions appears little different, but it is not contradicting against each other. So that is what I would like to focus today. So, and upon that, I would also like to let you notice differences in between the terms those are used to express the same meaning from time to time. So it may be possible that when you read different literature on similar topic, it may confuse you. So it's really important to kind of have an approach, like an open-minded approach when you are trying to learn the Buddha's teachings through different versions of translation. So from that point of view, first, let me explain the Four Noble Truths. According to the Theravada tradition, the Four Noble Truths are explained through 12 insights. Each Noble Truth is explained through or kind of practiced through or needed to be practiced through 3 insights. So when we multiply it 3 by 4, it becomes 4 insights, 12 insights. So that is the approach that is very commonly and basically used by the Theravada tradition. Now in that sense, in the general overview of these insights that is related to the each Noble Truth are like this. They say the Sach Jnana, that means knowing the nature of the truth. So that is, or the wisdom of the nature of the truth, or comprehending the nature of the truth. That is the first insight that is related to any kind of these 4 Noble Truths. And the second insight is Jnana, that is knowing what needs to be done, connecting with that truth. How to relate to that truth. That is the second level of insight that is important. So then Jnana, that is accomplishing what needs to be done related to that truth. Accomplishing the wisdom and the attainment related to the truth, whatever specific truth that is. So this is like 3 insights related to each truth. So here, the concept in many times is by those people who have kind of limited understanding and knowledge, they may look at it as quite contradicting compared to the Mahayanist approach of explaining or teaching the Four Noble Truths through the 16 characteristics or 16 aspects of the Noble Truth. But in actually, it is not contradicting. In Tibetan literature, we find that when the first sermon or the first turning of the wheel of Dharma is explained, it is always given the name. The sutra which recites the Noble Truth 3 times. So that means each Noble Truth is repeatedly taught in 3 times. So what does it mean? On the first repetition, it just introduces the Noble Truth. And in second repetition, it explains what needed to be done, how to relate to that Noble Truth. And then on the third repetition, it teaches how to attain the resultant state through relating to that Noble Truth. So this is not a kind of foreign concept for the Tibetan Buddhism and the Mahayana Buddhism. This is within there, but the Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism didn't have kind of emphasized that much on this aspect of the teaching or this style of the teaching. So this sutra itself says that in Tibetan we say Dini Dunge Pape Dembao. That means this is the suffering, the first truth of the noble beings. So this line of the sutra introduces the suffering, the first noble truth. Then on the same topic, it says that Dungel Shevacha, that means understand the suffering or know the suffering. So this is how to relate to that suffering, how to relate to that noble truth, the first noble truth, which was introduced before that, the suffering, how to relate to it. So it was explained in that next second line. And third line says that Dunge Shevacha di Shevacharme. That means suffering can be understood, but not in that way. So what does it mean? It explains, after relating to that, what can be attained. What can be attained? After knowing the suffering, there doesn't remain any suffering that could be known in absolute manner. Suffering doesn't exist in its absolute nature. It's empty and absent of the absolute nature. So in that way, when someone really kind of penetrates through that, the person attains the realization of the suffering. When they penetrate through that ultimate nature of the suffering, they have realization of the kind of realization related to the first noble truth. So it goes on like that. So the way the Four Noble Truths are explained through 3 insights, or in total 12 insights, is not a foreign kind of approach for the Mahayana and Tibetan or the Vajrayana Buddhism. So this approach goes through like that. Then it says that when it comes to the second noble truth, the origin of the suffering, then it says that this is the origin of the suffering, and abandon or get rid of the origin of the suffering. And then, though you can get rid of the origin of the suffering, but in its ultimate nature, you cannot get rid of it. Because in ultimate nature, origin of the suffering doesn't exist. So, that is the second way of how the three insights relate to the origin of the suffering. And then in the next level it goes to this is the cessation or the ceasing of the suffering. And then after that, attain or realize the ceasing of the suffering. Then finally it says that you can attain the ceasing of the suffering, the nirvana, or the cessation of the suffering, but it cannot be attained in absolute nature, because it doesn't exist in the absolute nature. And then finally, to the fourth noble truth, the true path. It says, this is true path. And then realize the true path. And once again, though you can realize the true path, but you cannot do it in its absolute nature. So it relates in that way to all these three different types of insights for each of these four noble truths. So now that is how it is explained in Theravadan tradition through that. But Theravadan tradition doesn't use the Mahayanist and the Northern tradition's style of explaining the Four Noble Truths through explaining the 16 characteristics. Explanation of the 16 characteristics has been quite unique approach of the Mahayana sutras and Mahayana kind of text. So when we get to the 16 characteristics, first we have this. Now here, since in Tibetan language, if we read in Tibetan language, or if we read in original Sanskrit language, there is no contradicting words that appear. But most of the time, since we read in translated English language, there is kind of usage of different terms based on the preference of the teachers and the translators. So sometimes it may confuse the disciples. So for that reason, I have taken the different terms that has been used by different famous translators. So Mahayana and Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we basically use the technique or the kind of teaching style of explaining this Four Noble Truths through explaining 16 characteristics. For a friend translator uses, instead of the word characteristics, they use the aspects. So it's all dependent on which is more understandable to you or more preferable to you, which relates more to yourself. First characteristic is impermanence. So the base is 5 aggregates, 5 common or ordinary aggregates of a human being. And it is explained 5 common and ordinary aggregates of the human beings are suffering or are in true nature. It is nature of the suffering because first thing is it is impermanent. Now here another translator prefer to use the term non-static phenomena, but I think if I use that term, maybe many of you get confused. What is that? So you have to be quite cautious about and alert about usage of the terms. So this is first characteristic or the first aspect, and the second aspect or the characteristic of the suffering or the true suffering or the truth of suffering is the suffering itself. And here another translator uses the word miserable phenomena. This is once again quite distinct word that we seldom use, but people prefer to try their own explanation and their own version of words. So this is the second characteristic. And the third characteristic, in general we use the word emptiness, and in here another translator uses the word void phenomena. Okay? Then the fourth characteristic is selflessness. The translator prefers to use phenomena lacking an impossible form. So these are the different versions of words that is used. Now let's investigate. What does it mean? What does it mean by impermanence? Basically, we are human beings. Now, Buddha doesn't teach us from this narrow perspective. Buddha teaches us from a very wide and very open perspective. So from that point of view, the perspective is the way explanation of suffering is very, very very profound. But most of the time, many occasions, many Western teachers and many other teachers, they prefer to relate the teachings directly to the disciples' life and disciples' experience. But how authentic it is, there is always a big question mark. Of course, it may be applicable, it may be practical to help the immediate disciple if we keep doing that. But then it is possible that if we just keep doing that, we end up in missing a big meaning from the Buddha's teachings. So basically, when we talk about the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, the basis on what we are talking about the truth of suffering is our own existence, our own aggregates. We all exist. We all feel, I am alive. If we don't feel that, it is impossible that we will be available, we will be sitting in this room today together. So we all know that we are alive, we feel that we are alive. So there is a basis to feel we. As long as there is a basis to feel we, there surely should have a basis to feel I. So when we have a basis on which we impute or label I, then we need to search for that, where it is. Basically, the common understanding is, it is the 5 aggregates that is combined together in our system, in our body, and we impute I on this very compound of 5 aggregates. So this compound of the 5 aggregates is the basis of establishing the truth of suffering. So how do we do that? The explanation of the truth of suffering says that this compound of the 5 aggregates is in true nature for the noble beings. It is a suffering. It is suffering for the noble being, for not a common human being, for not an ordinary human being. For an ordinary human being, it's very valuable. It's pure. It's happiness. It's full of enjoyment. But noble and superior spiritual human beings, they understand this as a suffering because first reason is it is impermanent. Since it is impermanent, it is changing every moment, every moment. Now here it is very important to know that the changing every moment, this is a very, very subtle teaching that was given by the Buddha Shakyamuni 2,600 years ago. In those days, when Buddha expounded this teaching about momentariness, changing every moment, it was kind of out of the imagination of those people living at that age and that era. So the Buddhism was given a kind of a nickname who accepts the momentariness. It is, according to them, it is a very controversial statement, very, very controversial statement, which cannot stand the logic. But nowadays, after 2,500 years and 600 years, science is proving this very obviously. Each of us are made up of billions of atoms, and each atom at its subtlest form is moving every moment. It is not static at all. For our common eyes, this tube light appear like it is just static there. But in reality, if we look through the scientific kind of those gadgets, then we will come to understand every moment it's moving, it's blinking, but blinking is so fast that we can notice it. So this is kind of an amazing exposition done by the Buddha without any kind of those how to say, very, very complicated machines 2,600 years ago, which was kind of negated by people in those days, and then they even given a kind of a controversial name. Nowadays, the followers of those tradition, they too say that now there is nothing controversial in what Buddha said in those days. So this is kind of an amazing exposition that the Buddha had done. So this is very important first kind of characteristic or the aspect of the 5 kind of this compound of five aggregates. Then, next reason, in true nature, according to the superior beings, this very compound of the five aggregates is suffering because it suffers. It suffers from time to time. Surely if we look into ourselves, if we do an introspection, there will be a lot of chances in our life we suffer. It is not necessary that it needed to be a kind of physical pain. There are mental agonies, there are dissatisfaction, there are a lot of kind of uncomfortable circumstances that we go through. So as long as we have this kind of compound of the five aggregates, that characteristic exists there. So this is the second characteristic. Then the third is the emptiness. Emptiness actually, in this level, is not the emptiness that goes to the very profound level. At this moment, the emptiness is like empty of kind of a clean nature. What basically we feel like our own aggregate, our own physical being is clean. We see that is dirty, there is dirty, that is also dirty. I am clean. That's quite natural for us. But in reality, it is kind of absent of real kind of purity and cleanliness. If we look into it, then we will come to understand. Each substance that builds up this compound of five aggregates, in reality, is kind of not pure, it's impure. Blood, tendons, bones, veins, and all these things, these are in nature are impure. So, empty of that kind of purity. Though we perceive it that I'm pure, I'm clean, but in reality it is empty of that kind of purity. So then, the fourth characteristic here is the selflessness. Now we feel on this compound of five aggregates, we impute I, me, and self, and we cling on that. If someone says something bad to us, if someone insults us, we feel very badly, because we say, why do they insult me? Why do they harm me? Why it is me? Why not other? It's a very natural thinking. So there is a kind of natural, inherent kind of clinging on the me, and that comes from this concept that we kind of develop in the course of time, me. So, in reality, if that compound does contain that kind of me inside there or not? Surely not. If there is that kind of me and I contained inside that compound, then if we investigate where it is, we should find it. But definitely, we will never find it because it doesn't exist inside there. It is just a kind of exaggeration, just a kind of a fabricated notion that our mind has created. Our subconceptual mind had created it, and then we cling on that kind of idea, that concept. So, this compound of five aggregates is absence of the self. So we say selflessness. So these are the, if we understand this, then it really helps us to understand why this compound of the five aggregates is suffering in true nature. Why it is understood as a true suffering by the superior beings. By the beings, those have attained higher levels of attainment in the spiritual practices. So it goes on like that. So this is a different way of exposition or the explanation of the truth of suffering, but it works in its own way. The other way of explanation is different, but it helps. So this is not contradicting. It is a different style of guiding the disciples and guiding the practitioners. So then we go further with the second noble truth. These have four characteristics, or the four aspects. And the first aspect is named cause. The cause. And the second aspect is named origin. Third aspect is, there are two different ways of, the first two terms are quite similarly used by different translators. But the third term, here we have little differences. One says strong production. Another one uses strong producers. So production and producers are two different things. But I think sometimes it also may relate back to the original term used in the Sanskrit or Pali. Because when we try to translate some concept from one language to another, in one language, one can be explained through the noun. In another language, it needs to use the verb. If something is explained through the verb in one language, it needs a usage of noun in another language. It's a kind of a complication of the languages. So it may be a result of that kind of thing. And the fourth is condition. So these are the four characteristics or the aspects of the second truth. The truth of origin of suffering. Or in the other words, they say true origin. Now, here, once again we use quite similar style or similar approach. What is the basis on which we try to establish this is the true origin of suffering? This is the true source of suffering. So here, according to the southern tradition, mostly they focus on using the craving as a true source of suffering. But in Mahayana tradition and in Tibetan Buddhism, it is not just a craving. It is a much wider kind of a subject. In the Sanskrit word, we use the word klesh, which stands for, now in a kind of a modern kind of translation, in English we use the word delusion. But the accuracy of the word, there is always a question mark. Either it is a kind of a delusion or whatever it is. It's a much wider kind of subject compared to craving itself. Craving is just one portion of the delusion. The delusion, what are the delusions? That is really important to understand here. Unless we pinpoint that, it doesn't make any sense, or keep talking about the origin of suffering or source of the suffering. So the second truth, the delusions are like desirous attachment, hatred, anger, ignorance. Craving is also a part of it. Exaggerative self-importance, or kind of a sense of prejudice or pride. So these are the very basic. And then also we can include the wrong view inside there. So these are the basic kind of few to count. If we keep kind of going into the details, they may appear more and more. Even just for an example, the sense of pride or exaggerated kind of self-importance can be explained or can be further divided into kind of 5 types of it. And then attachment can be further divided into 3 types of it. So it may keep going on like that. The wrong view can be further divided into 5 types. So it may keep multiplying like that. So briefly, these are the sort of the different emotions, or in the other sense, we say afflictive emotions, which also is quite similar to the delusion. Third noble truth is cessation of suffering. That means the state where the suffering has already ceased completely. Now here, in other kind of translation, they use true stopping. True stopping. This is a kind of rarely used kind of term. So, first characteristic of that is the cessation itself, the ceasing, or in the other translation they say stopping. And the second characteristic is pacification, same in the other translation. Then the third characteristic is being superb. Now this characteristic is kind of translated very differently by many different translators. The second, this translator uses superior states. So this is kind of quite different from each other. And the fourth characteristic is definite emergence, and it's also same in the second version of translation. So here in this case, now we understand that there is a suffering which is harmful, disturbing, and uncomfortable. Now we know that from where does it come from? It comes from the source of suffering, which is the origin of suffering, all these afflictive emotions. Now then we move forward and try to look, is it possible to stop the suffering? Is it possible to stop the suffering? Then we come to realize that, yeah, there is a possibility to attain a state where there won't be any more suffering. Given the condition that suffering comes from its causes. If suffering is coming from nothingness, we cannot stop it. If suffering is just existing there, not depending on any causes and conditions, then there is no way that we can get rid of the suffering. Since suffering is completely dependent on these causes and conditions, it opens up a big door of possibility to stop or cease the suffering. So we see a kind of big possibility. So then we try to look at how it is possible. What characteristics that state would be having where suffering is completely ceased. There in the picture comes out the fourth noble truth, the cessation, the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, the state where suffering has completely ceased. So we kind of imagine that state and try to look into that kind of characteristic. What kind of characteristic should that state have? And then in the picture comes in ceasing or the cessation. That state should be completely free from any suffering. Suffering must be ceased in that state. So that is first characteristic that the third truth, the truth of cessation, should have. And the second characteristic the truth of cessation should have is the pacification. In a state where all the sufferings are completely pacified, there is no possibility of any single suffering. Even if we have attained the stage, there are less numbers of suffering, but still the suffering exists. That is still not a kind of completely pacified state. So the cessation, a state where the suffering is ceased, must be free from any kind of those kind of conditions, or be pacified from any kind of those conditions. There should not be any kind of different kind of disturbances of that causes that may cause the suffering. And then the superior state. Now at presently, we may be happy from some time. We may be free from certain variety of suffering. Today, most of us are free from some very kind of serious sickness, cancer or tuberculosis or those kind of things. But it doesn't mean that we have achieved the kind of cessation of suffering. So what does it mean? If someone has really achieved the cessation of suffering, that state must be a superior state where there is no possibility of existence of any variety of suffering. Even if we are free from the tuberculosis or the cancer, but we still have certain suffering, certain minor suffering, certain other varieties of suffering. So as long as we are existing in that state, it is not a state that can be kind of branded or acceptable as a cessation of suffering. And then definite emergence. So a cessation of suffering, the state where someone achieved cessation of suffering must have this characteristic of definite emergence. That means they definitely have to be free from suffering. Even if there is minor variety of suffering still existing, that state is not acceptable as a state where the suffering is completely ceased. So these are the four characteristics that is indispensable in that state of being free from the suffering. Unless someone attains that kind of state characterized by these four characteristics, they are still not there, haven't attained that state of cessation of suffering. So from that point of view, we will come to understand, like, it could be possible that from time to time people may claim that I have attained nirvana, but in reality we have to look into that. Does his attainment meet with these conditions? If the person meets with those conditions, surely they have attained the nirvana. If the person claims that he have attained the nirvana, but another day he is crying, and then like in the kind of how to say, unbearable pain, how can we accept that? So we need to be very clear about what is nirvana. So this is the fourth, kind of third, the four characteristics of the third truth. So this is a quite kind of a good approach to explain, to make people understand what is nirvana. So then that comes to the next level. The fourth noble truth is the truth of the path. This, the fourth noble truth, also comes with the four characteristics. The first characteristic is pathway. And in the other translation, they use the characteristics or the aspect as pathway minds. And the second characteristic is awareness. In the next translation, they use appropriate means. So this is quite different. the meaning is quite different from each other. And the third characteristic here is achievement. In the next translation, they use means of actualization, quite different from each other. And the fourth characteristic is deliverance. And another version of translation, they use the means for definite removals. So here, once again, we see quite a big of difference between the usage of different terms and the words. It's quite important to notice these things, unless you may get confused from time to time. So, here, now, when we see that suffering, our own very existence, the kind of five aggregates itself is in true nature is nature of suffering, and it is produced by those disturbing and afflictive emotions. And if we really are serious to be free from the suffering, we need to attain a state with specific characteristics. Now, is it possible to attain that? There arises a big question mark. Now, then comes into the picture the true path, or the Four Noble Truths, the path. So, the path, when we come to the explanation of this word path, then it says that how can we get rid of the source of and origin of the suffering? So we are very sure that if we get rid of the source of the suffering, we will be free from the suffering. So how can we do that? Then comes into the picture the path, the virtuous qualities, positive qualities, which can get rid of those negative and afflictive emotions. And it's a law of nature. It's a law of nature that we cannot change. Heat goes against the cold. Hard goes against the soft. So this is a law of nature. Darkness goes against the brightness. No one can change this. So, in the similar way, the positive qualities of mind goes against the negative characteristics of the mind. And no one can change that. It is natural to us, natural to human beings. So, if we cultivate the positive emotions and positive qualities of the mind, then that will help us to reduce these negative and afflictive emotions. If we practice love, kindness, and compassion, then that will reduce the possibility of hatred and anger. That is an antidote, direct antidote against it. Now if we practice contentment and less desire, then that will reduce attachment, specifically desirous attachment. Now, if we practice the wisdom, then that will reduce the possibility of ignorance and wrong view. So it works in that way. If we practice sense of humility humbleness, that will reduce the kind of exaggerative sense of self-importance or the kind of sense of pride or prejudice. So this goes against each other. This is natural. No one can change it. So it is up to us. It is our choice. If we are serious about leading a good, happy, satisfactory life, then we have to choose the right thing. Now, choosing these right things is a pathway, is a path to achieve kind of eradication of those afflictive emotions. And that is also an appropriate means to get rid of those afflictive emotions which keeps bothering us. That is also the source of achievement. If we keep practicing in that way, gradually we will come to achieve the cessation of suffering. Step by step, we can cease more and more suffering. And then finally, it's the means of definite removal of all the suffering. So, in that way, we can gradually, if we practice in that way, move forward and then achieve the cessation of suffering, attainment of nirvana. So, this is a very brief introduction of Four Noble Truths.